In the quiet suburb of Westfield, New Jersey, a seemingly normal father kissed his children goodbye, walked out the front door, and vanished. For nearly 18 years, his house stood frozen in time, Christmas decorations still hanging, a haunting organ hymn playing on repeat, and 5 bodies hidden inside. This is the story of John List, a man who murdered his entire family, disappeared without a trace, and lived a double life while the world searched for answers. Welcome back to the Asylum. Today, we're unraveling one of the most chilling cases of calculated murder and identity deception in American history. Before he became one of the most infamous family annihilators in American history, John Emil List seemed like the perfect product of Midwestern discipline and faith. Born in Bay City, Michigan in 1925, he was the only child of devout German-American parents. His father, John Frederick List, was strict, deeply religious, and old-fashioned, a man who believed in order, obedience, and the fear of God. It was a worldview young John absorbed without question. He followed closely in his father's footsteps. A quiet, serious boy, fiercely Lutheran, and even a Sunday school teacher. In 1943, just months after graduating from Bay City Central High School, John enlisted in the United States Army, serving as a laboratory technician in World War II. That same year, his father passed away, leaving behind a legacy of rigid moral expectations and emotional distance that would shape John for the rest of his life. After the war, List returned home and pursued what seemed like the American dream. He enrolled at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, where he earned both a bachelor's degree in business administration and a master's in accounting. He was smart, driven, and by all accounts, destined for a respectable life. Commissioned as a lieutenant through ROTC, John List looked like a man on the rise. But behind the well-pressed uniform and carefully controlled exterior, something darker was beginning to form. By late 1950, the Korean War had reignited, and so had John List's military career. Recalled to active duty, he was stationed at Fort Eustis in Virginia, where fate introduced him to Helen Morris Taylor. A war widow with a young daughter named Brenda, Helen carried the quiet sorrow of loss and a need for stability that John seemed eager to provide. The two married just over a year later, on December 1st, 1951, in Baltimore, Maryland. For a while, it looked like a fresh start for them both. The Army, impressed with John's sharp accounting skills, moved him into the finance corps. After his second tour ended in 1952, the Lists began a new chapter as civilians. John built his career with quiet determination, first at a Detroit accounting firm, then as an audit supervisor in Kalamazoo, Michigan. It was there that the couple welcomed 3 children, and John rose steadily through the ranks to become a general supervisor. On paper, he was the American dream, a hard-working father providing for his growing family. But behind closed doors, Helen was unraveling. Struggling with alcoholism and concealed illness, her physical and mental health began to deteriorate. Unbeknownst to John, she had contracted syphilis from her late husband, a fact she had kept secret. As her condition worsened, so did the atmosphere inside their home. In 1960, when Helen's daughter Brenda married and left the household, John took a new job with Xerox in Rochester, New York. There, he climbed higher still, eventually becoming the company's director of accounting services. Yet despite his professional success, the home remained a quiet battleground. His wife's illness, his emotional isolation, and his rigid faith pressing in from all sides. Then, in 1965, another opportunity came calling, this time in Jersey City, New Jersey. John accepted a role as vice president and comptroller at a local bank. The family, now including his aging mother Alma, relocated to Westfield, New Jersey, into an enormous 19-room Victorian mansion called Breeze Knoll. From the outside, it was a picture of upper-middle-class success. But within those ornate walls, the weight of appearances was becoming too much to bear. November 9th, 1971, began like any other morning inside the List household. But by sundown, the grand halls of Breeze Knoll would fall into a silence that would last for nearly a month. John List, ever methodical, followed a cold, deliberate plan. While his 3 children were still at school, he approached his wife Helen from behind and shot her execution style in the kitchen. Then, he made his way upstairs to his 84-year-old mother, Alma. 1 bullet above her left eye. She never even had time to rise from her chair. He waited, patiently. When his daughter Patricia, just 16, and his youngest son Frederick, 13, returned home that afternoon, he greeted them with the same chilling precision. Each shot from behind, clean, efficient. Then, he made himself a sandwich. As if nothing had happened, List drove to his bank, calmly closed out his and his mother's accounts, and even took the time to watch his eldest son, John Jr., play in his high school soccer match. When the game ended, father and son rode home together, but unlike his siblings, John Jr. didn't go down easily. Evidence of misfires suggested he struggled, fought for his life, forcing his father to fire multiple rounds until the boy finally fell. List arranged the bodies of his wife and children on sleeping bags in the ballroom, like some twisted final tableau. His mother's body was left upstairs, untouched. In his study, he left behind a 5-page confession addressed to his pastor, claiming the killings were an act of mercy, his attempt to save their souls from what he called the corruption of the world. He removed himself, literally, from the family's history, cutting his image out of every photograph in the home. Then he tuned a radio to a religious station, turned the air conditioning to its lowest setting to slow decomposition, and vanished. The bodies weren't discovered for nearly a month, and no one questioned their absence, at least not right away. John had written letters to the kids' schools and part-time jobs, claiming they were off visiting an ailing grandmother in North Carolina. Coincidentally, Helen's mother had cancelled a visit just days earlier due to illness. Had she come to town as planned, List later admitted, she would have been murdered too. He stopped all deliveries, milk, newspapers, mail. But eventually, neighbors began to notice something was off. The massive house sat eerily still, its lights burning day and night until bulbs began to flicker out, one by one. That's when police were called. They entered through an unlocked basement window and found a house frozen in time and a ballroom turned morgue. Westfield was shattered. The town, which had seen almost no violent crime since the early 60s, suddenly became the center of a national nightmare. Media outlets flooded the quiet New Jersey suburb. A manhunt was launched. Hundreds of leads followed. But all reliable photos of John List were gone, and he'd left behind no clear trail. His car was found abandoned at JFK Airport, but no flight records linked him to any destination. It was as if he'd simply disappeared. In the months that followed, the tragedy took on a near-mythic quality. The house, Breeze Knoll, sat empty, as haunting as the crime itself. Then, in August of 1972, flames engulfed the mansion. Though officially labelled arson, the case remains unsolved. Among the ruins was a stained glass skylight, rumoured to be a genuine Tiffany piece. Its value estimated at $100,000, then over $750,000 today. Lost to history, like the lives taken beneath it. Helen and the 3 children were buried together in Westfield. Alma's body was flown to Michigan, returned to the Lutheran cemetery of her youth, and the space where Breeze Knoll once stood. By 1974, it was replaced by a new home. But the memory of what happened there, the cold calculation, the silence, the time capsule of death, could never be built over. When John List walked out of Breeze Knoll in November of 1971, he didn't just vanish, he erased himself. With chilling precision, he boarded a train and disappeared into the folds of America. First, Michigan, then Colorado. By early 1972, he had resurfaced in Denver with a new name, a new life, and no trace of the man he used to be. He called himself Robert Peter Clark, Bob to his neighbors, a name lifted from an old college classmate. The real Bob Clark would later say he never knew John List. But it didn't matter. The mask fit, and John wore it well. He landed a job as a comptroller at a paper box company, stayed out of trouble, joined a Lutheran church, and even organized carpools for fellow congregants. If the devil hides in the details, List had buried his past so deeply, even the people closest to him saw nothing but kindness and order. In 1985, he met a quiet church-going woman named Dolores Miller. They married, and in 1988, the couple settled in a suburb of Richmond, Virginia, just another middle-aged couple living a modest life in Midlothian. He was still Bob Clark, and still, remarkably, working in accounting. In a bizarre twist, John List's name once appeared on a shortlist of potential suspects in the D.B. Cooper hijacking case. His sudden disappearance, resemblance to the sketch, and motive of desperation raised eyebrows. But after his eventual capture, List denied any connection, and investigators found no evidence tying him to the infamous skyjacking. For 17 years, List eluded justice. But then came a new tool in law enforcement's arsenal: America's Most Wanted. In May 1989, during the show's first season, producers aired a segment on the List murders, featuring a clay facial reconstruction made by forensic artist Frank Bender. The bust, age progressed to reflect how List might look nearly 2 decades later, was eerily accurate, capturing not just his features, but his uptight demeanor and dated glasses. Less than 2 weeks after the broadcast, a former neighbor from Denver picked up the phone. On June 1st, 1989, Bob Clark was arrested at his office in Richmond. Even then, he clung to the alias for months. But a fingerprint match to his army records, and damning physical evidence from the original crime scene, forced him to admit the truth. On February 16, 1990, the mask finally fell. He was John Emil List. In court, List painted a picture of a man cornered by fate. He claimed the bank closure in 1971 left him jobless and humiliated. But rather than confess this to his family, he pretended to commute to work every day, spending hours at the train station or in empty offices, feigning routine while secretly draining his mother's bank account to stay afloat. But the strain was mounting. His wife's health, ravaged by untreated syphilis and alcoholism, was deteriorating rapidly. The disease had remained hidden until 1969, when a routine exam finally uncovered it. By then, Helen had become increasingly erratic, even cruel, publicly belittling John, mocking his masculinity, and isolating herself from the world. List told the court he saw only 2 options: welfare or death. But welfare, he claimed, was a fate worse than death, an unforgivable failure in the eyes of his rigid upbringing. A court-appointed psychiatrist diagnosed him with obsessive-compulsive personality disorder. The murders, the psychiatrist argued, were List's twisted attempt to protect his family's souls from what he viewed as inevitable spiritual and social ruin. On April 12, 1990, the verdict came down: 5 counts of first-degree murder. During sentencing, List, still eerily calm, claimed diminished responsibility. "Because of my mental state at the time, I was unaccountable for what happened," he said. "I ask all affected by this for their forgiveness, understanding, and prayer." But the judge wasn't buying it. "John Emil List is without remorse and without honor," he declared. "After 18 years, 5 months, and 22 days, it is now time for the voices of Helen, Alma, Patricia, Frederick, and John F. List to rise from the grave." List received 5 consecutive life sentences, the maximum punishment available. List later appealed the conviction, arguing that PTSD from military service had impaired his judgment, and that the confession letter left for his pastor should have been considered privileged. The appeals court rejected both claims. In rare interviews after his conviction, List tried to make sense of what he'd done. "I wish I had never done what I did," he told Connie Chung in 2002. "I've regretted my action, and prayed for forgiveness ever since. When asked why he hadn't taken his own life, his answer was chilling in its conviction. Suicide, he said, would have damned him, separating him from his family for eternity. In his mind, killing them had sent them to heaven. Killing himself would have barred him from joining them. It was the ultimate contradiction. A man who had destroyed his family in the name of salvation, hoping still to meet them in paradise. John Emil List spent the final years of his life behind prison walls, far from the grand Victorian mansion where he had once tried to play God. On March 21st, 2008, at the age of 82, he died of complications from pneumonia at St. Francis Medical Center in Trenton, New Jersey. There were no mourners, no family left to grieve the man who had stolen so much life in the name of salvation. When the news broke, the New Jersey Star-Ledger didn't call him a father, a husband, or even a murderer. They gave him a different name, one that had echoed through Westfield for decades. The boogeyman of Westfield. He had lived in shadows, hiding behind false names, religious justifications, and emotionless logic. But in the end, the man who tried so hard to vanish left behind a legacy that could never be buried. A portrait of control, delusion, and cold-blooded calculation. The lights of Breeze Knoll may have gone out long ago, but the horror John List unleashed there still lingers like a ghost in the quiet corners of suburbia, reminding us that sometimes the most terrifying monsters wear a suit and tie, smile at church, and sit quietly beside us in the pew. If you found this case disturbing, and you should, make sure to subscribe for more true crime stories that peel back the mask on the darkest corners of human behavior. This is The Asylum, where the truth isn't just stranger than fiction, it's more terrifying. Until next time, stay curious and stay safe.